Rami Malek walked onto the stage of the Ed Sullivan Theater with his usual quiet poise, the audience applauding warmly, the band playing a short tune, and Stephen Colbert rising from behind his desk with that familiar grin, microphone in hand, ready to exchange his brand of sharp humor with his guest. Rami gave a small wave, shook Stephen's hand, and sat down in the chair, leaning back, his expression unreadable, as if he were already analyzing the situation like one of the characters he had played. Stephen looked at him with that glimmer of mischief in his eyes and said, "Rami Malek, everybody. Now I have to say, you're one of the most fascinating people to interview, because you never know whether you're about to give a 10-minute monologue about art or just stare at me silently until I panic." The crowd laughed, but Rami didn't. He simply tilted his head and said, "Maybe silence says more than words sometimes." Stephen chuckled nervously and responded, "Well, this is television, so words pay the bills." The audience laughed again, though Rami still didn't. Instead he leaned forward and said in a quiet but cutting tone, "Nobody fucking likes you, Stephen." The words dropped like a stone in the room. There was a half-second pause before the audience nervously laughed, unsure if it was a joke, a bit, or something real. Stephen froze in his seat, still smiling but with eyes blinking rapidly, calculating how to handle this live moment. "Wow," he said, "thank you for that warm welcome. That's a first." Rami sat back, his face unreadable, and added, "I mean, I've heard it backstage, I've heard it from actors, musicians, even crew. People find you exhausting." The audience let out a mixed noise, half gasp, half uncomfortable chuckle. Stephen tapped his pencil against his desk and replied, "You know, I've always said one of the joys of my job is hearing what my guests really think. Though usually they save that for after the cameras are off." Rami smirked faintly and said, "Maybe I just don't care about the cameras." For a moment the tension in the studio felt thick, and the band in the corner shifted uneasily. Stephen, never one to retreat from conflict, leaned in and said, "All right then, let's have it out. Why don't you like me? Or rather, why don't people like me? Enlighten us." Rami folded his hands in his lap, his voice calm, almost soothing, which made the words sting more, "Because you try too hard. You're always inserting yourself into every story. You ask a question, but you already want the punchline. It's not conversation, it's performance, and sometimes people just want to be heard." The room was silent now, no laughter, just the sound of Rami's words settling into the air. Stephen tried to hold his composure, but the edge of defensiveness crept into his tone. "Well, forgive me, but this is a performance. This is late-night television. If I sit here in silence while you think deep thoughts, the network cancels us in a week." Rami nodded slowly, as though he expected that answer, and said, "And maybe that's the problem with shows like this. You're more worried about ratings than about authenticity." Stephen leaned back, forced a smile, and quipped, "Well, my authenticity pays for the air conditioning in this theater, so forgive me for keeping the lights on." That finally got some laughter from the audience, but it was thinner than usual. Rami looked at him with an intensity that made Stephen shift in his chair, then broke into a small laugh himself, the first of the night. "Relax," Rami said, "I'm not here to ruin your show. But someone had to tell you. Otherwise, you'll just keep going in circles." Stephen exhaled, tapping his cards against the desk, clearly rattled but also intrigued, because conflict meant attention, and attention meant viewers. "All right," he said, "you've taken your swing at me. Now let's pivot. You just did Oppenheimer. Incredible film, by the way. Did you enjoy being part of something so monumental?" Rami shrugged and said, "It was different. Nolan runs his set with precision. No small talk, no jokes. Just focus. You'd probably hate it." The audience chuckled at the jab, and Stephen forced a smile, replying, "So you're saying Christopher Nolan has better manners than me?" Rami leaned in again, his tone half serious, half teasing now. "No, I'm saying he doesn't need to prove he's the smartest guy in the room." The audience reacted with a louder laugh this time, sensing that maybe this was some elaborate bit, though Stephen's tightened jaw suggested otherwise. He adjusted his glasses and said, "You know, most guests come here to promote their work, maybe tell a fun story about filming, maybe talk about meeting Robert De Niro at a restaurant, not dismantle me on my own show." Rami replied coolly, "Maybe I'm not most guests. Maybe I'm here because it's too easy to keep doing the same polished interviews. People want something real. Isn't that what you say about your show all the time, that it's about truth wrapped in comedy?" Stephen gave a dry laugh. "I usually say it with less profanity, but sure." The tension eased slightly as the audience found their footing again, but it was clear this wasn't going to be a typical late-night chat. Stephen shuffled his cards, glanced at the camera, then back at Rami, and said, "Well, stick around, folks, because apparently tonight Rami Malek is going to either destroy me or save me. Either way, you don't want to miss it." The band kicked in with a short riff, the camera panned across the applauding audience, but as it cut to commercial, Stephen leaned slightly toward Rami, his smile never breaking, and whispered, "We're not done." Rami simply gave a faint nod, his face calm, almost amused, as if this was exactly the reaction he had expected. When the cameras came back from commercial, Stephen sat upright at his desk, papers squared perfectly in front of him, his smile wider than usual, the kind of smile that masks a slight irritation, while Rami sat back in his chair, arms crossed lightly, eyes scanning the crowd as if he were still deciding whether this was a performance or a genuine confrontation. Stephen cleared his throat and said, "We are back with Academy Award winner Rami Malek, who apparently doesn't think anyone likes me, but he still agreed to come on the show, so maybe that's something." The audience laughed, a little more relaxed now, and Rami leaned forward, saying softly but with a sharp undertone, "I came because I wanted to see what it was like, Stephen, and I didn't expect to confirm so much of what I'd heard." Stephen chuckled, tapping his pen against the desk, and replied, "Well, let me guess, you heard from actors who felt I talked over them, comedians who thought I stole their punchlines, or maybe directors who say I'm too smug for my own good." Rami tilted his head and said, "Not exactly, but close. Mostly people say you're more interested in your own performance than theirs, and sometimes it feels like you're competing with your guests instead of listening to them." The audience reacted with a mix of oohs and awkward claps, sensing the sting in Rami's words. Stephen nodded slowly, then leaned back, folding his arms in mock seriousness. "Okay, then tell me this, Rami. What would you have me do? Just sit here silently while you wax poetic about method acting? Let the audience drift off to sleep while you tell me how you practiced staring in a mirror for hours as Freddie Mercury?" The crowd laughed, but Rami didn't. He kept his calm, piercing look fixed on Stephen and said, "I'd have you listen. That's all. People remember interviews not because the host was clever, but because the guest was allowed to reveal something true." Stephen's smile faltered just enough for the cameras to catch it, and for a moment, the studio seemed unusually still. Then he leaned forward and said, "All right, let's do that. Reveal something true, Rami. Tell me something you haven't said on 100 red carpets." Rami hesitated, then said, "During Bohemian Rhapsody, when I was struggling with how to embody Freddie's vulnerability, I'd go home and feel empty. I questioned if I was enough, if I was capable, if I deserved to play him. People saw the final performance, but they didn't see the nights I sat alone, wondering if I was failing him, failing myself. That's truth. And you didn't need to jump in with a punchline for people to feel it." The audience broke into warm applause, some cheering, clearly moved, and Stephen leaned back, his eyes softer now, almost caught off guard, then said, "That's powerful. Thank you for that." But almost immediately, his instinct kicked in and he added with a grin, "Though I'd have killed for a story about Freddie's ghost haunting you." The crowd laughed, but Rami smirked and shook his head. "See, you can't help yourself. That's what I mean." Stephen raised his hands in mock surrender, guilty. "But you know, people watch late night not because they want a therapy session. They want to laugh, they want to unwind after a long day." Rami leaned closer, lowering his voice so it carried even more weight. "And maybe they also want to see you be human for once, not just the guy with the perfect comeback." The room buzzed with murmurs and low laughter, the tension turning into fascination. Stephen, feeling the pull of both conflict and opportunity, decided to push further. "All right then, let's go human. You tell me something real, I'll tell you something real. That fair?" Rami nodded slowly. Stephen adjusted his glasses, exhaled, and said, "There are nights I go home after this show, after making 1,000 jokes, and I feel like I didn't connect with anyone. Like I was just throwing lines into a void. And sometimes I wonder if people laugh because it's funny or because they're supposed to. That's the truth." The audience quieted, no laughter this time, just silence as they listened. Rami gave a small nod and said, "See? That's what people want. Not the performance, but the person." Stephen tapped his desk, breaking the heaviness. "Well, if I start doing that every night, CBS will probably replace me with Jimmy Fallon by Friday." The audience erupted in laughter, easing the tension, and even Rami cracked a smile. Stephen leaned in again, sensing an opening. "You know, Rami, you've got a reputation too. People say you're intense, maybe even difficult, that you don't play the game. How do you think that comes across? Rami thought for a moment, then said, it probably makes me seem cold. But I'd rather be misunderstood than be fake. Hollywood has enough people pretending. Stephen nodded, then teased, so you're saying you'd never, for example, dance with Tom Cruise on a talk show couch to promote a movie? The audience laughed, and Rami deadpanned, not unless Tom Cruise carried me. The laughter grew louder, and Stephen chuckled, relieved to find some rhythm again. Okay, that's funny, he admitted. But then Rami added, I can be funny, Stephen. I just don't feel the need to prove it every 5 seconds. The jab landed again, the audience reacting with a collective gasp laugh, that strange noise they made when they weren't sure if they should laugh or feel sorry for the host. Stephen pressed his lips together, then smiled thinly and said, well, lucky for me, proving it every 5 seconds pays the bills. Rami tilted his head again, and maybe it costs you more than you realize. The band softly played a note, like they were trying to diffuse the tension, but everyone in the room knew this wasn't an ordinary segment. It felt raw, unpredictable, almost uncomfortable, and yet no one could look away. Stephen shuffled his papers, clearly rattled but trying to keep his composure. You know what? I think the audience is getting a better show tonight than I planned. So thank you, Rami, for keeping me honest. Rami gave a faint smile, not smug, just measured, and replied, that's all I wanted. Stephen turned to the camera with his practiced smile and said, stick around, folks, because after the break, Rami might either hug me or hit me. Either way, ratings gold. The audience laughed and clapped as the camera zoomed out, but both men sat in silence for a moment, Rami calm and unbothered, Stephen drumming his fingers on the desk, his smile frozen but his eyes revealing he was already planning his next move, determined not to be outshined on his own stage. The cameras returned for the final segment, the audience buzzing with anticipation, sensing that something unusual had been unfolding between Stephen Colbert and Rami Malek, the tension palpable but strangely magnetic. Stephen straightened his papers, took a sip of water, and leaned toward the camera with his trademark grin, though his eyes betrayed a hint of weariness. We're back with Rami Malek, who has spent the evening giving me the toughest performance review of my life, he said, the audience laughing, but Rami leaned in and replied calmly, I just think honesty matters, Stephen. It's not about tearing you down, it's about reminding you to listen. The audience murmured, some clapping lightly, clearly divided between admiration for Rami's candor and discomfort for Stephen's position. Stephen chuckled, shaking his head, you know, in all my years on this stage, I don't think I've ever had a guest sit across from me and say to my face, nobody fucking likes you, and then double down on it for the next half hour. Rami gave a slight grin, well, maybe no one else had the guts. The audience erupted in laughter and a few cheers, and Stephen tapped his desk with mock exasperation. Great, now you've turned them against me too. He leaned forward suddenly, his tone shifting from comedic to sharp. But let me ask you something, Rami. If honesty is so important to you, do you think you've always been honest in your own career? Because I've heard people call you distant, hard to work with, even arrogant at times. Do you think that's fair? The room went quiet again, all eyes on Rami, who took a moment before answering. I think people confuse boundaries with arrogance. I don't schmooze, I don't play the Hollywood game, and maybe that makes me less approachable. But I don't lie about who I am. Stephen nodded, but the look on his face suggested he wasn't finished, and he added, so maybe you and I aren't so different after all. Maybe we're both just trying to survive in jobs that demand constant performance. The audience clapped at the thought, sensing a moment of reconciliation, but just as Stephen began to relax, Rami leaned closer and said, the difference is, Stephen, I don't need people to laugh to know I'm worth listening to. A ripple went through the audience, some gasping, others laughing nervously, and Stephen's smile froze before he finally laughed, a short, sharp burst, and said, well, you've certainly given the internet enough clips to chew on tonight. Suddenly, a loud thud came from backstage, followed by the sound of something crashing, and the audience turned their heads as crew members rushed past. The cameras kept rolling as the disruption echoed through the theater. Stephen, still at his desk, tried to joke, well, either the building's collapsing or we just lost another celebrity to our greenroom snacks. The audience laughed nervously, but Rami didn't, his expression serious as he watched the commotion. A stagehand leaned in and whispered something quickly to Stephen, who blinked and then forced a smile to the camera. Folks, live television, never a dull moment. But whispers spread in the crowd. Apparently another celebrity scheduled for the following week had dropped by unexpectedly and ended up in a heated argument backstage with a producer, loud enough that microphones had picked it up faintly. Stephen's face tightened, realizing the chaos was bleeding into the broadcast, and he turned to Rami, half joking, half exasperated. "See? It's not just me people don't like." The audience burst into laughter, finally releasing the tension, and even Rami chuckled, shaking his head. "Looks like honesty's contagious," he said. The two men sat in silence for a beat, then Stephen leaned forward and for the first time that night, spoke with no punchline. "Look, Rami, I may drive people crazy sometimes, I may talk too much, but I do respect my guests, even when they make me feel like I've been through a war on live TV." Rami looked at him steadily, then cracked a small smile, "And I respect anyone who can take it and keep going." The audience applauded warmly, sensing a resolution, and Stephen extended his hand across the desk. Rami hesitated for a second, then shook it firmly, both men smiling genuinely this time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Stephen said, turning back to the camera, "Rami Malek, reminding us all that honesty might be the hardest performance of all." The band struck up the closing theme as the audience rose to their feet in applause, the tension of the night giving way to something surprisingly cathartic, and as the cameras faded out, both men leaned back in their chairs, exhausted but strangely relieved, knowing they had just created one of the most talked about late-night moments of the year.